Grüß, willkommen in einem Fragens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 61 of my games system design series. In this video I'll investigate a Napoleonic figure game card-based scenario generation system. I never had much luck in my early use of card-based systems in any of my figure games, so I never went down this path when I was trying to solve the perplexing issue of designing an ad hoc scenario generation system. However, one of my comrades suggested this. I expect because of his Euro games experience and the fact he has daughters which seem to like card-based games. So far, I found the results of my forced experimentation extremely encouraging. I have to admit I was more surprised than I expected that adopting a card-based system would work so well. The framework I'll be discussing today is a framework, obviously, and players need to modify this as required for the set of rules they wish to adopt. I have focused on creating the simplest possible system which provides the necessary bling to make it an interesting, functional and exciting ad hoc scenario generation system. Mistakes were made in my initial thoughts, but the results so far look quite workable. This, of course, was not created in a vacuum. I had created a table-based scenario generation system, which worked, but to put it mildly, was boring eventually. Basically, each player spins a dice to determine a force mix, and often we would spin and decide to spin again because the result was anything but particularly exciting to us, which is not a good system. Just to clarify, the issue of generating ad hoc scenarios primarily exists for Napoleonic's World War II and Cold War games, as these require asymmetrical force mixes with reinforcements in order to be interesting. Two equal forces battling it out with each other does not work in these periods, but it does work in the Ancients period. I even suspect for Ancients a more asymmetrical system would be beneficial. However, I must admit the DBMM points-based system works beautifully, and for those who are interested in history, refighting a historical battle is still viable, although I must admit most of the rules aren't really designed for it. Before I developed this card-based system, due to my inability to create an ad hoc scenario generation system for Napoleonics, primarily, and World War II and Cold War, I had mainly focused on refighting historical conflicts, especially for Napoleonics. However, I do realise a workable ad hoc scenario generation system would still be nice to have. Any ad hoc system needs to be based on points. Each element has a points value, and some ratio, preferably, even should be aimed for. This, was each side has the perception they have an equal force mix to the opponent, and the key factor to determine victory or loss is skill. So even though the force mixes are asymmetrical, the whole structure has to give each person the impression they do have an approximately equal force mix to the other. Of course, in reality, trying to achieve this is not really very simple, but let's go with this premise for now because I think I have actually solved it. The points value for elements, or bases, vary by the rules being used. For simplicity, I'm using a figure game version of the SPI board game Napoleon at War, which I call Grosse Schlachten. In this case, the points value is equal to the combat strength of the element. Players would adjust this as required depending on the rules being used, but I also use a similar system for bloody big Napoleonic battles as well. Next, we need to look at scale. If you're using a set of rules which can reproduce an entire battle, historical battle, your basic formation is core for larger battles or large divisions for smaller battles. I'm uncertain if this system would work if you're reproducing just a small part of a larger battle, but there are many smaller battles which did occur, involving 1 to 3 regiments per side. So if you wish to reproduce those, this system kind of really works for that as well, although it really is designed to reproduce battles around about the minimum size of about 10 to 15,000 men per side, going up to 100,000 plus per side. Now we have to address army lists. I have battled with this more times than I care to consider, but in the end the best army list is the historical formation used in a historical battle. It's simple. Players can fire the TO and E easily enough, and no one can whine about how unhistorical the force mix is. Of course, players may select unusual formations, but even if they did, the formation is historical and probably has a mix of advantages and disadvantages. For example, you could select the Guards Corps at Wagram, good troops, but if using a point system, you'd have very few troops, and it would be rather cavalry heavy. Not good if facing an Austrian infantry corps, for example. Before we actually move into the cards, it's important to remember players will be randomly selecting cards in order to build up their force mix. For my initial test set of cards, I've selected Wagram 1809 as my base army list. This shows the corps which were involved, or could have been involved, at Wagram in 1809. To match the French, I've included the 5th Corps, which did not arrive in time to become involved in the battle, but I needed it in my card deck to give the Austrians an approximately even force mix compared to the French. These cards show the French forces, also consisting of approximately 9 corps. I originally tried a wide range of different systems, but after testing this, the conclusion was each side should have about 9 corps if the desired points was, let's say, 48 points. With this force mix, each side could have from 4 to 6 corps per side, depending on reinforcements and how they wish to deploy their forces. So providing 9 corps provides some variability and choice in the force mixing or force mixes used in the game. If playing a large battle, you would need to perhaps create more cards and vice versa, although after experimenting this for quite a few years, 9 cards is really all you need as your cards to select from. By 1809, most armies were using corps, but in earlier battles, corps were less common, so you may need to move to a divisional system. At Marengo, the French had corps, very small ones, but they were corps. But the Austrians only had wings, one big one very small one, and a medium-sized one. You would probably need to evenly divide out the divisions into corps-like formations in some way, shape or form. In addition to the actual force mixes, we'd also include other cards for command control, victory condition, and a few card mechanics cards such as disposal of any card that you may have selected or dummy cards. These would need to be modified for different rules, and in some rules we'd need to add new cards and remove some of these cards. Players could insert a lot of bling in these cards, but after some failed experiment, the cards need to be reasonably well balanced, so a lot of thought has to go into it. The positives and negatives need to kind of balance out in some way, shape or form. Now let's drill into the cards. I must point out what you're seeing here is a very early card, and while my cards actually have changed quite a bit over the 3 to 4 years after I created this video initially, the basic structure remains much the same. The French player selects from only, obviously, the French cards. This indicates that this is a French card, that is the flag in the top right corner. The cards themselves are based on the THEORIE of corps at specific battles. I use Nyhorster, you may use other types of THEORIEs. This indicates the year and, if applicable, the battle, if there are more than one in a given year. So you can see here 1809. This is pretty much bling, but historical details about the corps level formation can be included. I normally include the commander, but as this was a bit confused at Wagram, I've not included it in this particular case. This area represents the forces in elements. I have included element quality values from 2 different sets of rules here, but in simple terms, I is infantry, C is cavalry, A is artillery. An asterisk means it's light or horse artillery. In addition, there is a quality or troop quality value, such as elite or E for elite, or superior, R for raw or inferior, and if there's no value, it's basically ordinary or trained. There is a very special troop class included here, the Old Guard, which is the only element of this quality at Wagram. Depending on the rules, you would place whatever troop descriptions would be applicable. Now we come to the points value. The key value of the card is how the points are calculated. The first value, 16 points in this case, is the value of a corps if it's available on game turn 1 onwards, either deployed on the playing era or arriving on game turn 1. This would be the normal points value of that force mix. The next value is the points value of this corps if it arrives at the quarter point of the game. If the game length was 12 game turns, then this would arrive on game turn 4. The points value is discounted by a quarter or 25% to reflect the fact that it's only available for 9 of the normal 12 game turns in a game. The first important point is every game needs to have a specified length. If your game lasts for a single day, then this chart provides some game lengths based on the game turn scale, season and region. The standard game would be 12 game turns in length, but far in the north, in summer, the days would be longer, 14 game turns, for example. In the same region during winter, the games would be shorter, 10 game turns, for example. If the game turns do not divide evenly, then you would spin a d6 or flip a coin per element to determine if it arrives early or late. So if the game has a length of 10 game turns, the quarter point is 2.5, which means reinforcements arrive on either game turn 3 or game turn 4. The next value here is if the core arrives at the half point of the game, which would be game turn 7 if a 12 game turn game. This allows a player to form up their forces over a period of time to reflect late arriving forces or outflanking moves. My more modern cards actually have all quarters in the game, Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, and the discounting occurs accordingly. So if something comes in the last quarter of a 12 game turn game, then it only has the value of its 25% of its actual full value, and so on. If we're using a 48-point game, the French could start with 24 points, in this case the 9th Corps and a cavalry reserve, or the reserve cavalry. If this was a 12 game turn game, on game turn 4, the 4th Corps would arrive, and it would have a value of, in this case, 12 3/4 points. In my more modern sets of cards, I round all fractions up or down accordingly because it makes it easier to calculate. Again, my early cards, I erred on the side of caution and included the fractions. Finally, on game turn 7, the 3rd Corps arrives, with the points total being 50 1/4. In my system, the points can be modified by plus or minus 3 or 4, with there being a VP or victory point impact. In this case, the opposing player gains 2 victory points. Reinforcements arrive either on the friendly player edge or can arrive on either flank, between the centre and the friendly player edge, if the flank is indicated before the game begins. Before we look at other force mix options and the other cards, the deployment process needs to be covered. I'm not covering terrain setup in this video, and this is another major issue I have problems with. However, I come to the following basic playing area layout. I lay no claims it's perfect, but allows play along any axes and is reasonably realistic. This shows the basic road network. I now embed streams into my basic playing area, and this shows the 4 streams, which are typically at each corner. You can actually put the streams in other locations, but what I've discovered is that I'm better off embedding the roads, standard roads, and embedding the streams. And then the only variable part of the terrain is hills, swamps, etc. Some of the streams you could indicate are becoming rivers, and this gives you, but nonetheless, this gives you a reasonable water feature layout, loosely modelled on actually the Battle of Waterloo, believe it or not. The only flexible pieces of terrain that I normally deploy are things like woods, swamps, etc. I typically place woods around the streams. Some of these could be marshes or even lakes. I normally place a standard sized woods or marsh or lake piece. This just shows the general area where those particular terrain pieces are placed in some sort of density. All the area terrain pieces that I use have a size typically of 5 centimetres wide, because my bases are 4 centimetres wide and I have a lip at the edge, and they're normally around about 9 centimetres wide, which means you could put 2 4 centimetre squares on top of it. And you can have them a bit longer or shorter. I've got other videos which go into the terrain in a little bit more detail. Once all the woods and swamps are placed, I then place hills or ridges in between the rivers. The theory is that the streams represent the low levels, and what's in between the streams must be higher up, thus must be hillier. All area terrain pieces, once again in my case, have a size of typically 5 centimetres wide by 9 centimetres long. That is if the base width is 4 centimetres. And, I just simply make them longer or shorter as required. Finally, although I must admit I typically put the built-up areas up front, but anyway, we then deploy the built-up areas. Each objective, the red dots, gets a built-up area. Each road entry point gets a built-up area. I place a built-up area in between the existing built-up areas on the roads, and then place a number against the streams, which could also represent bridges or not. Some of the built-up areas could be made up of more than one base square, either 3 centimetre square if you're using 6mm figures, or 4 centimetre square if you're using 15mm figures, or 6cm square if you're using 25mm figures. Again, depending on the base width. If an objective is made up of more than one built-up area, indicate which square, built-up area square, is the actual objective. In some games, the built-up areas on either flank road exits and defender road exits is a special objective. If more than one square, indicate which is the objective. To avoid confusion, objectives should only be one base width square. The attacker and defender is determined by the start forces on either side. The player with the higher points total on game turn 1 is the attacker, and the opposing player is the defender. The ratio determines the axis plays on that you play on, either long or short axis, and the deployment process. If the attacker outnumbers the defender by 1.5 to 1 or greater, plays along the long axis. Well, actually, if it outnumbers the defender by more than 1.5 to 1, the plays along the long axis, and the defender deploys anywhere except within 4 base widths of the attacker edge. The attacker arrives from off the playing area on game turn 1. If the attacker outnumbers the defender by 1.5 to 1 or less, plays along the short axis, and the defender deploys anywhere except within 4 base widths of the playing area. The attacker arrives from off the playing area on game turn 1. If the ratio is the attacker is 1.25 or less than the defender, then the defender deploys anywhere except within 6 base widths of the attacker edge. The attacker deploys anywhere within 2 base widths of the attacker edges. Normally, reinforcements arrive along the player edges, but in my later sets of cards, it's possible to pick a card which allows you to arrive on the flank, and in some very exceptional circumstances, in the defender rear. As a flank attack is determined by the random selection of cards, this is a secret from the opposing player, so the opposing player doesn't really know what if there's going to be a flank attack. Also, the point along the flank that you can arrive depends on all sorts of factors, such as the quality of your commander and the quality of the enemy commander, so you will need to divide the flank up accordingly, and that's all in the scenario deployment rules. As indicated in the earlier video, victory is based on the attacker's first-time occupation of one of the 3 objectives and the occupation at the end of the game. VPs are gained for eliminating enemy elements, and there are VP implications for going over or under your points total. Depending on the VP system used, this shows a possible range of results. The defender's VP total is subtracted from the attacker's total, with the defender rarely having many VPs in a game, because most of the VPs are actually generated by attacker actions. To basically understand how the victory conditions work, if the attacker takes 2 objectives during the game but loses 1, it has gained 36 VPs and will most likely achieve a draw. If an attacker only takes 1 objective, it will most likely lose, as the most it could achieve is 24 or 12 VPs. It's unlikely the attacker could not take at least 1 objective, so a decisive victory requires extraordinary incompetence or other factors such as losses to achieve an attacker decisive defeat. If the attacker takes 2 objectives and hold both, it will win, or the attacker will win, having achieved at least 48 VPs. It's very unlikely an attacker can take all 3 objectives and hold them, so 60 VP is about as good as you can expect. Anything greater takes extraordinary brilliance for an attacker to achieve, or extraordinary incompetence on the defender's side. Now we go to some of the special cards. Some of the special cards affect VPs, with a player, if an attacker, gaining special VPs if they occupy one of these special objectives at the end of the game. These cards are kept secret. The disadvantages is reinforcements cannot arrive on that particular flank, but the benefit are that they can gain additional VPs if they occupy this point at the end of the game. Before the game begins, each player selects a C&C card, which may contain some special rules. If the C&C provides benefits, there may also be a points cost. What I do these days is that if you play even though it's an ad hoc game, it's typically based on an actual historical game, and as a result the player has to select the historical commander, and the historical commander will be superior, inferior, incompetent, or basically ordinary. There are other cards which affect command control, and these are some of them. Some of these cards would be randomly selected and tends to only impact the sub-commander. In this case, sub-commander's quality can be improved or can be impacted with a corresponding points impact. These days in my more modern cards, what I do, again, because I base all my battles on historical battles, if you select a historical core as your force mix card, you get that commander with its values. So there is no random selection of commanders. However, there are special cards which could indicate that a commander has an off day or an on day. There are also some special cards allowing a player to dispose of an unwanted card, or to indicate an objective card may be held but is not, or possibly a dummy card which would confuse the opponent's player. Remember, the opponent only ever gets to see these cards face down until they're actually used. One possible process is as follows. Each player selects a CNC. If a CNC is superior, that player can select a force mix card from the deck, and the opposing player randomly selects a card. The decks are shuffled and each player selects a card each until a player decides to stop, or until the force mix exceeds the game limit, irrespective of how they're organised. If it exceeds the game limit, the last card is disposed and the player uses the cards already selected. This is if you want to select everything randomly. Once again, I'm experimenting these days with the actual force mix cards not being selected randomly, and you just sit down and look at your 9 cards and select your force mix and reinforce schedule accordingly. I must admit, for Napoleonics, I think it's still better to have them randomly selected, but it's certainly an option players can experiment with. Objective and dummy cards are always kept face down. If more than one objective card is selected, the player may choose whichever card they wish to use and dispose of the remaining card just before play begins. The remove one card can be played at any time. It can be used to avoid exceeding the points limit or removing one objective card. If more than one is selected, this is pointless, but if only one objective card is selected, it could possibly be used. What I've showed you so far is not by no means an extensive range of cards, but to avoid a game becoming a card game, the card number should be kept as low as possible, and players can experiment with different ideas. This allows players to quickly create a force mix with reinforcement schedule and add special rules as required to their game, basically simulating an actual historical scenario in an ad hoc manner, and this can be all done in probably 10 to 15 minutes max. A great way to create an ad hoc game. And so we come to an end of this video, concluding episode 61 of my video series on game design theory, in this case creating a card-based scenario generation system. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.